Right, guys, we're going to finish up the cardiovascular system now. So I want to look at the cardiac cycle. So the cardiac cycle would be the sequence of events that occurs between two heartbeats. So usually start off the cardiac cycle at atrial systole. So systole means contraction, diastole means relaxation. So usually cardiac cycle starts off when the atria contract to push blood into the ventricles. That's called atrial systole. And the ventricles have to be relaxed to receive the blood. Now, after the ventricles have been filled with blood, then it's time for the ventricles to contract. So that next phase is called ventricular systole. So before the ventricles actually eject blood though, they actually have to build up the pressure that they need. So there's the first part of ventricular systole where the ventricles are just building up the pressure that they need. And in this phase, these valves are going to close. So these would represent the bicuspid and the tricuspid valve, they close. And that brings about the first heart sound. Then now, once the pressure is great enough, the semilunar valves are going to be pushed open and blood is going to be ejected from the ventricles. That's the ejection phase of ventricular systole. After the ventricles have ejected the blood, then the ventricles are going to, the entire heart is going to start to relax again, and that's relaxation. And while the heart is relaxing, the atria gets filled with blood. So the ventricles would be relaxed and the atria are also relaxed. And it's at this point that the semilunar valves will close. The valves in the pulmonary artery and the aorta will close while you are in diastole relaxing. So this brings about the second heart sound. And then once the the atria have been filled with blood, then there'll be a time when the valves will open and blood will just passively flow into the ventricles before the atria actually contracts to squeeze blood into the ventricles. So this is what constitutes the cardiac cycle. So the key things to note is, where do you have the heart sounds? So you have the lobe sound right here. That's the first heart sound. And it's due to closure of the atrioventricular valves The next heart sound comes right here, which is the dub sound. And it's due to closure of semilunar valves, closure of semilunar valves. Right, so this entire cycle has to be coordinated because of the electrical system in the heart. So the electrical system in the heart has to coordinate the cardiac cycle in such a way that you have the ventricles getting a chance to be filled before they contract, and the atria gets a chance to fill the ventricles before they contract. So you have to have this process being regulated. If there is dysregulation, you're not going to have effective heartbeat. So you might have the ventricles contracting. If the ventricles were to contract before they became filled with blood, then there would be no blood really being injected out of the heart with the heartbeat, and that would drop the blood pressure, and that could cause the person to faint. And if it continues for a long period of time, it could cause death. So you want to make sure that you have a coordinated system so the atria knows when to contract before the ventricles. So that's the electrical system in the heart. So the pacemaker is known as a sinoatrial node, which is found in the right atrium. That's where the electrical impulses are generated from. And then we have some fibers running from the right atrium to the left atrium. So at first, when the electrical impulse is generated, the first place that we want the impulse to go to would be the two atria, so that they can contract first. Then the impulse comes to this atrioventricular node, and this AV node actually kind of slows down the electrical impulse to give a chance for the atria to contract before the ventricles contract. So it slows down the impulse. The impulse travels down this called the bundle of His, and then it separates into two branches, right and left bundle branches, which goes to the ventricles. And then, so eventually the impulse will get to the ventricles so they can contract after the atria have contracted. So this question says, starting with atrial systole, describe the mammalian cardiac cycle. Your answer must include how the cycle is initiated and the mechanisms that are in place to prevent the backflow of blood. So the cycle is initiated at the sinoatrial node, which is in the muscle of the right atrium. So the sinoatrial node emits impulses that travels across the cardiac muscle in the atria, stimulating the atria to contract. The electrical signals then move to the AV node, which delays the impulse. So it allows atrial systole, so it allows the atria to contract, forcing or emptying blood into the ventricles. And in this period of time, the atrioventricular valves are open. That's the semilunar valves and the bicuspid valves, but the semilunar valves are closed. Signals from the AV node, after the atria have contract, the signals from the AV node will then travel down the bundle of His and then to the Purkinje fibers in the ventricles, allowing the ventricles to contract. And then you have ventricular systole. So both ventricles contract, forcing blood out of the heart into the arteries. In this period of time, the AV valves close and the semilunar valves are forced open. After that, we have atrial and ventricular diastole, where the chambers relax and are filled with blood. The mechanisms to prevent backflow would be that we have valves in our veins. And we have valves between the atria and the ventricles to prevent the reverse of flow, reverse flow of blood. And then I want to go on to tell you what are the factors affecting your heart rate, how many beats per minute, right, from your heart. So the average adult heart rate is about 70 beats per minute. But if you exercise, that increases the heart rate because your tissues need more oxygen. Stress or excitement can also raise your heart rate. Rest can lower your heart rate. Many drugs, such as caffeine and nicotine, also has an effect on the heart rate. So you have a question here which says, explain the regulatory effects of blood carbon dioxide levels and the hormone adrenaline on heart action. All right, so what's the effect of carbon dioxide on your heart action? So there are chemoreceptors in our blood vessels, especially in our carotid arteries. They monitor the concentration of carbon dioxide and other substances. When we have a high level of carbon dioxide in our blood, it leads to the stimulation of our sympathetic nerves. And these nerves actually are known as cardiac accelerator fibers because they connect to our sinoatrial node and cause our heart rate to increase. So increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide in the blood would lead to an increase in the heart rate because of the fact that it triggers the sympathetic nervous system. Adrenaline is a hormone released from the adrenal gland. So whenever you have nervous anticipation, impulses from the brain will stimulate the adrenal glands to produce adrenaline. The adrenaline will circulate in the blood and will get to the heart. It is going to have a stimulatory effect on the sinoatrial node, and this is going to cause your heart rate to increase, and it also makes the force of your contraction increase. So the ventricles will contract more forcefully to eject more blood, and the heart rate increase. So what it's trying to do is to make your cardiac output be increased so that you can supply more blood to the tissues that will allow you to respond to whatever stimulus is causing you the nervous anticipation. All right, so then we come to this question, which is a simplified view of the mammalian heart. So I want you to help me to label this heart here. So we are to identify structures A to D. So, well, A to C. So what is structure A? All right, so structure A would be the aorta. Good. Structure B. So structure B would be known as the tricuspid valve, yes, or you can call it an atrioventricular valve. And structure C would be another atrioventricular valve, but this one would be the bicuspid valve. All right, so the question now asks, structure D is a semilunar valve. So we can call it the aortic valve because this is found in the aorta. And you're asked to tell how would the person's blood pressure be affected if the structure labeled D was defective. So what happens if the aortic valve becomes defective? How does that affect the person's blood pressure? All right, so let me see what you have here in the chat. All right, so when you say low, you have to say which aspect of the blood pressure will be low. Would it be the systolic pressure or would it be the diastolic pressure? So the damaged aortic valve will lead to backflow of blood during diastole. This would lead to a decrease in the diastolic blood pressure. So this person's systolic blood pressure will not be affected because that's the blood pressure that you get when the ventricles are pushing the blood into the blood vessels. That wouldn't be a problem, but it's when when the heart is relaxing and the semilunar valves should be closed. If one of them are open, then blood is going to be coming back in the heart instead of going forward in the blood vessels, and that's going to drop the diastolic pressure. Okay, we have another question here with the heart. This is 2012 question 2A. So figure 3 is a diagram of a longitudinal section through a mammalian heart. Show the main chambers and the electrical system. So we have to label structures A to E. So you can start off by telling me what structure A is. All right, so structure A would be the sinoatrial node. Yes. B, what is B referring to now? All right, so that's pointing to the right atrium. So no, they're talking about the electrical system and the chambers. So either they're asking you about electrical system or a chamber. And so what is B pointing to? All right, so B is pointing to the right atrium. All right, what about C? All right, so C would be the AV node. That's correct. D, so that's the bundle of His. Right, bundle of His. E is pointing to the left ventricle. Okay. So state the rule. So the sinoatrial node is where the electrical impulse is. So it initiates the electrical impulses for the cardiac cycle. All right, C we said was the AV node. So the AV node delays, causes a slight delay in the conduction of the electrical impulses. So that the atria contract before the ventricles. D now is a bundle of His. So this conducts electrical impulses to the ventricles. And then it asks you, what is the role of the autonomic nervous system in the function of the heart? So the autonomic, it can regulate the heart rate and the force of contractility of the ventricles. So the sympathetic nervous system can cause the ventricles to contract more forcefully and cause the heart rate to increase. And the parasympathetic nervous system would do the opposite. All right. So I believe that would mean that we would have completed the questions on the cardiac cycle. Just checking to see that all of it was done. Not the cardiac cycle, the circulatory system. So we have looked at the blood vessels, we have looked at the cardiac cycle, we have looked at the heart structure, we looked at the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. So it means we are finished with the circulatory system. We're just going to go right ahead and start looking at the other broad topic, which is biodiversity and conservation of the environment. So just some slides to give you some reminders. So bio means life and diversity means variety. So biodiversity is defined as the variety and variability among all groups of living organisms and the ecosystems in which they occur. So the more we have different types of organisms living in different ecosystems, the more variety we have. And there are three classifications of biodiversity. There is genetic diversity, species diversity, community or ecosystem diversity. Genetic diversity refers to the variety of different genes and traits available within a species. Species diversity is the variety of species that you have living in a community. And ecosystem diversity is a variety of ecosystem and habitat types you have in an area of land and water. Biodiversity is important. Genetic diversity is important for the survival of the species. It also helps to protect our freshwater resources. It allows an ecosystem to recover more quickly from natural disasters. It helps to maintain the balance of the ecosystem and makes it sustainable for growth. It also provides food security. It allows organisms to be able to adapt to different habitats. It provides biological resources for us. It promotes soil formation and protection, and it can maintain the food chains. So, first question says, within any ecosystem, biodiversity exists at three levels: genetic, species, and ecosystem. Discuss the interaction amongst these three levels of biodiversity, including your answer and explanation of each level: genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity. So first, we start off with genetic diversity. So genetic diversity refers to the differences that exist among members of a species of a population, and it's because of the variation in their alleles or genes. The more genetic difference which occur among members of a population, the more variable is the population. Smaller populations are more prone to loss of genetic diversity. When population size decreases, genetic diversity can be lost. So the more you have different alleles in a species, that's the greater the genetic diversity. Species diversity now refers to the number of different species in a given habitat. So it's also called species richness. And species diversity is usually dependent on the geographical location. As one moves further away from the tropics, species diversity decreases. Ecosystem diversity now refers to the number of different ecosystems that exist in a given geographical area, including macro ecosystems, which are large spatial areas like swamps, deserts, and forests, and micro ecosystems, such as small parts of the ecosystem, such as the pH of the soil or the hill in a tropical forest, which provides a different environment from other parts of the forest and allow for the occurrence of specific species found only where those parameters exist. So this is a 9-mark question, and they have said that they will give you 1 mark for each of the points. So they're expecting you to give 3 points under each type: genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity, right? That's how they expected you to answer this for the 9 marks. And then there is a 2016 question 4B. It says, discuss 2 environmental benefits of maintaining biodiversity. Include a definition of biodiversity in your answer. What are the benefits of maintaining biodiversity? Well, we did see some of them in this slide. that we saw before, but it wasn't really well organized. You know, it was just throwing it out there. Just give me a second, guys. Yes, so now let us talk about why should we try to preserve biodiversity? You know, in fact, there was an article in the BBC recently about this entire problem that we have. So we are facing two major ecological problems right now on the planet, which are going to eventually have economic consequences, social consequences, environmental consequences. So with the issue of global warming, we're having changes in our climate, and that is making several habitats unsuitable for different species. So what we have been having with the global warming is that we have been having a decrease in our ecosystem diversity and species diversity. Then now, as that declines, we now have other problems that are stemming from that, which is now a loss of biodiversity. Because if we have some species being eliminated, we're going to have decrease in our biodiversity. So now, what will that have? What effect will that have when we now have decrease in biodiversity? All right, so biodiversity is the variability among living organisms or species, genetic and ecosystem variability. So the ones you say variability amongst living organisms, you would have captured what the word biodiversity means. Bio means living organisms, diversity means variability. So benefits of biodiversity, two environmental benefits they wanted. So there are many benefits, but they wanted environmental ones. So when you have a lot of biodiversity, there is reduced destruction whenever you have natural disasters. For example, some coastal ecosystems can reduce the effects of storms. You also get ecosystem stability because you get complex food webs. When you have more species, you get more complex food webs. So it means that they are able to resist adverse effects of the environment. So if something should happen, or if there is an environmental change, there will be a lower impact if you have more biodiversity because of the complexities of your food webs that you have in that habitat or in the ecosystem. Also, it helps to stabilize the climate because due to carbon storage, it helps temperature modification, it helps to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and store it in our plants. So tree species diversity is linked to temperature, solar radiation, and rate of water loss from leaves. So anyway, they're saying that the more biodiversity you have, especially of trees, it does help to stabilize the climate. Water purification is also a benefit we get from having high biodiversity because you now have diverse organisms that can remove and break down harmful substances from our water. It also helps us to recycle waste nutrients. So diverse organisms are needed to degrade waste and to recycle nutrients. And there are also benefits related to agriculture, for example, pollination of crops, source of pests, disease, stress-resistant genes, biological control of pathogens. So by far though, the greatest ones I would say that you get when you have biodiversity and is when you have the ability to resist natural disasters and changes because of the stability that you gain by having so many different species with so much genetic variety, you can have more complex food webs. So if there will, the ecosystem more or less can withstand changes and survive, or the ecosystem will recover from changes more quickly. Right. So anyway, you can give any two benefits of environmental, the environmental benefits as well as the definition of ecosystem. I believe this was a total of 5 marks. All right, continuing now, how do we conserve our environment? We have in situ and ex situ conservation methods. In situ conservation means that we are conserving on site. It is a conservation of the species in their natural habitat, and that is their maintenance and recovery, especially of the endangered species. For example, when you have natural parks, wildlife sanctuaries, you're keeping the species in its own habitat. Ex situ conservation means off-site conservation. This is the conservation of endangered species in man-made habitats and that tries to imitate their natural habitats, such as zoos, aquariums, etc. This gives us a classification scheme. So the in situ conservation would be, as we said, keeping the organism in its own habitat. So that would include national parks, wildlife sanctuaries. You can have bigger ones called biosphere reserves, which can be terrestrial or marine. Small ones include like sacred groves, sacred lakes. Ex situ means off-site conservation in man-made habitats, such as botanical gardens, zoological gardens, seed banks, field gene banks, cryopreservation, etc. Now, each method has its pros. They have their pros and their cons. So in situ would mean that you are conserving genetic resources in the natural habitat. So you can maintain the interactions with other species and organisms. It conserves intraspecific variation and can be combined with various degrees of conservation of interspecific variation. It's applicable to species with orthodox and recalcitrant seeds and to vegetatively propagated species. They're talking about animals per se, plants, sorry. The disadvantage or difficulties with this is that space is required, resources prone to loss by accident, pest, and disease. A network of spatially separated conservation areas is required to capture the variation of the target species. Information is required for silviculture and management interventions is needed to meet specific conservation targets. All right, so that's basically saying in layman term that you need resources to cordon off these areas to say that you're going to keep the organisms in their own natural habitat, and that takes resources. And it still means that the organisms can be prone to disease, disasters, etc., unless you are controlling the environment. So it is good though if you can keep them in your own habitat because you can maintain the relationships that they have with other species and maintain variation. So those are some benefits. The ex situ now, let me go to this one here. There's minimum work sometimes for like seed banks. Lesser space is required. That is for seed banks. And you can still conserve your variation provided that you do save a wide variety of species. But this is talking about plants. Unfortunately, not all plants can be stored in seed banks because sometimes the seeds are not recalcitrant and the species do not reproduce as by vegetative propagation. Sometimes you may require a large amount of space and it does not help to conserve the relationships in this ecosystem. So you're going to lose those interactions that you would have had if you left the animals or the seeds or the plants in their own ecosystem. So giving examples distinguish between in situ and ex situ conservation methods. So in situ conservation methods refers to measures applied in natural habitats or sites where organisms live, while ex situ refers to measures applied outside of the natural habitat or site, remote from where the organism lives. Examples of in situ conservation will include national parks, protected reserves, preventing pollution, protection from introduced species, etc. So you can leave them where they are, just make sure that they're not, the organism is not getting exposed to new species and they're not in an area that is excessively polluted. And so protecting the natural habitat from threats can allow a species to be conserved. Examples of ex situ conservation now, which are man-made, would include botanical gardens, zoos, gene banks, including seed banks, sperm banks, embryo banks, etc. So this other question now, 2015 question 4 says, there is a continuing debate as to the nature of the relationship between biological diversity and ecosystem stability. Outline the current view of the nature of this relationship and briefly discuss the evidence in support of your viewpoint. So it is generally agreed that the higher the biodiversity in an area, the more stable that ecosystem will be, because the ecosystem will have more complex food webs, it will have more stable numbers of species, and there will be an increased complexity associated with greater stability. So several studies were done to prove that more biodiversity equals ecosystem stability. So some field studies included an ecological field study of a grassland in the USA showed that when you have a reduction in your plant species richness, it lowered the resistance of the entire grassland to drought. So the area became more prone to having droughts whenever you have less species in that area. So other examples would be like the grazing ecosystem in the Serengeti. They realized that a high biodiversity was linked to higher stability. There's also another study by Payne. He studied the animals that live along a stretch of rocky seashore. By removing one predatory sea star species after a time, he noticed the biodiversity decreased greatly and that stability no longer exists because you had dropped, you remove one species from the area and the ecosystem no longer was very stable. And other evidences, so you basically just need to be able to report one of them to support your argument of saying that higher biodiversity promotes high stability. There were also studies of microbial communities in small experimental chambers, shows that fluctuations in ecosystem functions such as productivity can be greater when species richness is reduced. So the less available species, the less efficient the ecosystem is. So global interest in biodiversity has grown in recent decades in parallel with the growing concern about the need for conservation. Discuss why loss of biodiversity is a major concern, and in your discussion, cite one direct and two indirect benefits of maintaining biodiversity. Biodiversity is essential for the benefits or the values it can provide to human beings. Loss affects ecosystems, it affects ecological relationships, and it affects the functions of ecosystems. Loss of biodiversity may be seen where there are disruptions of food webs or food chains, and that leads to the degradation of the ecosystem. More biologically diverse ecosystems are more productive, and less biological diverse ecosystems are less productive. Loss appears to be as important as climate change or pollution, and hence it may be, it's a major concern. So the same effect that climate change might have on an ecosystem or pollution might have on an ecosystem is the same effect that a loss of biodiversity can have. There is also the concern that a loss in biodiversity could reduce nature's ability to provide goods, services, and a stable climate for us humans, hence the need to conserve and protect biodiversity. So that direct benefits include that species can provide various goods for human consumption, such as food, fuel, and drugs, and also provide products of economic importance, such as textile, lumber, silk, paper, leather, and also the maintenance of species which are resistant or tolerant to unfavorable conditions. So you just need to state one direct benefit. So first you need to discuss why biodiversity losses are concerned. So you would have at least needed 2 points from here. Then you need to give one direct benefit of maintaining biodiversity. So, sorry, they awarded you 2 points each. Then indirect benefits, you had to give 2. So the indirect benefits would be, so services, some pollination, services provided by the ecosystem, which are not tangible goods, would include pollination, the ability to do nutrient cycling, regulation of the atmosphere and the climate, detoxification and decomposition of our waste. So those are things which are not tangible, but we actually need those services. Also, it provides ecological value by giving us a stable ecosystem. There's also cultural and spiritual value by preserving sacred plants and animals. There's also ethical reasons, which says that it's an obligation to protect all life forms from extinction. Aesthetics, it does have, it helps with tourism, recreation, and future potential. The fact that we may discover drugs in the future in these ecosystems that can cure various diseases, etc. Then it says here, distinguish between in situ and ex situ conservation of biodiversity and give an example of each type. We already kind of did this. So in situ conservation is the conservation of the species in their natural habitat. For example, parks, protected areas, and ex situ is a preservation of components of biological diversity outside their natural habitats, such as gene banks, seed banks, sperm and ova banks, field banks, in vitro plant banks, microbial culture collections, captive breeding of animals, artificial propagation of plants, collection of living organisms in zoos, aquaria, botanic gardens for research, and public awareness. So any of the examples you wanted to give, as long as you tell what it is and be able to give at least one example. Using your knowledge of ex situ conservation methods, briefly comment on 3 limitations of using ex situ conservation methods to maintain biodiversity. The limitation of ex situ conservation method is that you cannot recreate the habitat as a whole. You're going to try to mimic the natural habitat, but you can't exactly recreate it. It's expensive to implement and maintain, and it may alter the natural evolution or adaptation processes. Genetic variation may be lost with each regeneration cycle, and it is ineffective for certain species, such as plants with recalcitrant seeds that do not remain fertile for long periods of time. It's difficult to maintain species away from their natural habitat, and it risks them being exposed to disease and pests. So these are just some of the challenges with us trying to recreate a habitat for an organism, a man-made habitat, versus us trying to preserve the organism in its own habitat. All right, so the last point now wants us to discuss, again, what is meant by species diversity and stability of a community. So by now, you should be more familiar. What is species diversity? I'd like to hear from you now. What is species diversity? What would you say? All right, so be careful when you say the amount of variation amongst the species, as you may be talking about genetic variation. So it's the variety or range of species present in a community, right? So variety or range of species present in a community. And then what do they mean by stability of an ecosystem? So when we talk about ecosystem stability, it's the ability to maintain balance that's one aspect. It's the ability to resist changes or withstand disturbances without significant change, sorry. It's also the ability to recover to quickly recover from disturbances or changes. That would be how you would say that an ecosystem is stable. Now, the next part of the question asks, explain why species diversity is positively correlated with ecosystem stability. Your answer should make reference to resistance and resilience of the communities in the ecosystem. All right, so what we realize is that when we have a higher species density, then we have a more resilient ecosystem. That's the first thing. So higher species density results in a more resilient ecosystem. We have to say why. So it means that you have more complex interactions and feeding relationships in that ecosystem when you have higher species reaches. So there will be complex food webs and interactions in the community. And another important thing is that multiple different organisms may carry out a function. So it means that if we lose one or two species, we can still carry out the function. So if we don't have any disturbance, such as natural disasters or the removal of organisms, we are more likely to see resistance to that. So there's higher resilience and resistance to disturbances. Telephone and the glass. The disturbances so there's higher resilience and resistance to disturbances in the event of, sorry, disturbances such as natural disasters and removal of species. Right, let me give you another 2 points. Right, so what you'll find is that with greater species richness, the ecosystem is more efficient. As no, as there isn't a dependence on one species to carry out a process. So at the risk of not repeating ourselves, the ecosystem can recover more quickly from disturbances. So it can resist disturbances, and if the disturbances happen, it can recover more quickly. It can be very efficient because you have multiple different organisms there carrying out multiple different processes. A lot of times they're going to be carrying out, several species are going to be carrying out the same function. So if God forbid something should happen to a species, you have so many different species there that another species can take up the slack and carry out the function of the one that's missing. So at the end of the day, the higher the species density or the higher the species richness, I should say richness and diversity, not density, you're going to get a more resilient ecosystem. All right, so that is it as it concerns ecosystems, stability, and conservation. So I'm going to give you another break after that. We have two more broad topics left to discuss with it, which would be health and disease and then immunology. So I'll give you a longer break for now.